Hi everyone, I hope that you're well. Thank you for joining me as we go through another revision question that will help you with your GCSE history exams. Today we are looking at the question, explain why developments in vaccination were important in the prevention of illness and disease in the 19th and 20th centuries. This would be your question 4 in an exam paper and is worth 9 marks. On the screen as you begin, I've got some ideas that should be coming to your mind as you are reading this question. So first of all is this image of this gentleman here, who is Edward Jenner. So as you're beginning to think about developments in vaccinations, this should be somebody who is very important, who comes to your mind, who is connected to vaccinations. We're going to talk a little bit about what he did later on in this video, but his name should be something that is at the centre of this question. Second of all, I have this graph here. The reason why I've got these two graphs, I should say, is because it's talking about why developments in vaccination were important in the prevention. So the fact that it's asking us why it was important means that we have to come up with a reason that shows that this was a significant contribution. And these graphs indicate just that, because through these graphs we can see the per million population that was being impacted by smallpox, and then the date when vaccination was enforced by inspectors, and a very, very dramatic decline in cases following that, which indicates the successes, the importance of vaccination. Another graph that we're going to look at later on is looking at early childhood mortality rates from 1851 to 1911. Again, this is going to be a graph that really helps us to indicate the importance of vaccinations and the impact that it has on childhood mortality rates in England. So for this question, you can see it as being in 2 steps, or alternatively, you can think of this as being 2 different paragraphs. In terms of paragraph 1 or step 1, we've got to be able to provide several reasons to support the view that the factor mentioned in the question was important or significant. So really here we're developing this answer, we're developing several points. So it's not enough just to write 1 or 2 reasons. That's one of the first really important things that we must remember. And the other thing is that we are looking at showing this importance or significance. So how are we going to demonstrate that this vaccination was important in the prevention of illness and disease? Again, just to remind you, it's important to include specific factual detail. This is what demonstrates to the examiner that you have got that knowledge, that key contextual knowledge. In your second paragraph or step 2, this is where you are beginning to make sure you provide a reasoned judgment upon the degree of importance rather. And during this one, this is where you was trying to state whether this has had a huge impact, a short-term, not very big impact, but long-term, maybe bigger impact. Was it initially seen as a problem where people argued against it? Did it have a negative impact? Was it actually a problem? And this is where you begin to make links to those longer-term impacts that I began to hint at as well. So on to our step 1, which can also be seen as our paragraph 1. Here are some of the things that we want to begin to talk about. So first of all, you would want to introduce to the examiner that you understand that vaccinations were not new. So this question is asking about the developments in vaccinations for the 19th and 20th centuries. So you do not want to spend long on this point because it is not relevant to the time period. But what this does is it provides the examiner evidence that you have got contextual knowledge. So your introductory sentences to this paragraph could state that you understand that vaccinations are not new. They date from the 18th century and inoculations were from before that. You could even indicate that you know the difference between inoculation and a vaccination by providing the definitions. I don't want you to spend too long on this, but a simple statement that sets the scene that you understand that vaccinations are not new to this time period provides that historical context. As I indicated previously, your most important thing that's going to be relevant to this question is the work that Dr. Jenner did regarding smallpox. So you would want to move your first paragraph quite swiftly into talking about smallpox and the vaccination that came through Dr. Jenner's work. You'd want to briefly summarise what Jenner did. I'd recommend between 4 to 5 sentences. I'd recommend that Jenner, initially it was guesswork, but then he used science through observations and experimentation to provide evidence to support his guesses. I would talk about how he experimented on a 12-year-old child. I would talk about how he had noted that milkmaids who had suffered from cowpox did not seem to get smallpox. And I would talk about how through this evidence he was able to quite concretely feel that by providing people with a form of cowpox, this in fact made them resistant to smallpox, and thus the idea of vaccinations for smallpox began. You're going to start talking about the impact that this had. So you would want to give some context to the exam that you understand how deadly smallpox was. So between 30 to 60% of those who caught it died. This was a disease that seriously impacted England and Britain during the 19th centuries. This is why the work that Jenner did is so important. But again, you're demonstrating to the examiner that historical context that you understand. You understand that smallpox was so deadly that this work from Dr. Jenner, and therefore the vaccine that could eradicate smallpox, is fundamentally important. It is very important. You could also add that you know, in your historical context, that globally smallpox was eradicated in 1980. This followed work from the World Health Organization, making sure that smallpox vaccination was a global vaccination campaign. This means that there has not been any cases since 1980, and it is officially considered to be a disease that is not in circulation anymore. This really indicates to you how important that vaccination, the development of the smallpox vaccination was. So you're able to almost tell a very short story within this first paragraph. You can summarise what Jenner did, how he came up with the idea, what the idea was, linking it to cowpox, talking about how deadly that smallpox was, and then talking about how it's been eradicated by 1980. So you've got a very clear journey, very clear story that indicates how important this prevention was. You could also continue to talk about some of the vaccines that were introduced in England following World War II. For these, you could include, this is kind of like your summary 2 or 3 sentences. So you could say polio vaccine was introduced in 1955, measles in 1963, MMR in 1988, and hepatitis B in 1994. The majority of your paragraph is going into details about smallpox. That's the one where you're providing the most amount of evidence and explanation, your largest chunk. But you can conclude this by saying, smallpox was what seemed to be the beginning of quite a large run of the government introducing vaccination programs, and that's where you can indicate polio, measles, MMR, and hepatitis. Because what you're doing is, again, providing that historical context. You are demonstrating that you know that the government became involved in these vaccination programs and therefore were involved in the prevention of illness and disease. Then you want to move on to your step 2, which is making sure you provide a reasoned judgment upon the degree of importance and significance. So for this one, I would really emphasize these 2 graphs. And this is where I would talk about how the introduction of the vaccinations being obligatory initially did not have a large impact. This is because society did not feel that they had to enforce the vaccinations. So even though it was being made compulsory, like in 1867, it actually took quite a long time, 4 years, for the vaccination to be enforced by inspectors. So what we've got here is the demonstration that the developments of vaccination actually, in the short term, in the immediacy, had a rather limited impact. It did have an impact, you can see here, occasionally does go down, but we've still got peaks. what you could say here is your contextual knowledge that you know for a vaccine to be successful, it needs to be administered or applied by 95% of the population. So therefore, you can say that this early introduction, 1853 and 1867, the follow-up, they're limited in their importance for the prevention. It wasn't until 1871, where it's enforced by inspectors, that we're beginning to see a drastic decline down to almost zero in England in terms of cases. So this really helps you indicate and make clear your judgment. It was important, yes, but in the short term, its importance was limited. It became more important after the enforcement by inspectors. What this map here shows, this graph, sorry, I should say, shows early childhood mortality rates through England from 1851 to 1911. And what we're seeing here is a steady decline in mortality rates. What this means is children are more likely to live beyond the age of 4. This is good news. This map, if we continued it on this graph, if we continued it on forwards, we would see that it continues to gradually decline, indicating that more and more people are living beyond the ages of 4. If you link this to some of the previous points, where you're saying, I know that this graph goes only to 1911, but you could continue to say that there has been an increase in children surviving beyond the ages of 4 since the introduction of these vaccines of polio, measles, MMR and hepatitis B, then that really does support your judgment that you're making that this has been a significant event. Now, as you're concluding this statement, what would be very nice in your paragraph 2 is a final 3 or 4 sentence that highlights your contextual understanding that there has begun to be people who are increasingly against vaccinations. So you could talk about how you know that there's been a link between MMR and autism made by a single scientist in a single paper. And you could talk about how it may be that in the long term, society does not like government intervening, does not like these links that are demonstrating there are potential risks to vaccines. And we may see in the long term, in the future, a decline in its importance in the prevention of illness and disease. What you are doing in those final few sentences is indicating to the examiner that your historical context, your knowledge of this event is ongoing and that the developments are still happening. You are indicating that this could be changing for the 21st century and beyond. But you can quite confidently claim that the impacts of vaccinations in the prevention of illness and disease in the 19th and 20th century showed an increase in life expectancy and a decrease in child mortality rates. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to posting another video in the future.